MCTs are relying on your body's ketogenic process. Ketone salts, they deliver BHB directly into the blood, so you're not getting any of that natural ketogenesis. And esters are this kind of like hybrid between direct delivery and, actually, depending on the compound, you don't get any classical hepatic ketogenesis from those. And so some of the stuff we're looking at Buck is fatty acid-based ketone esters. And so we're trying to get the benefits of both, some direct BHB delivery and some hepatic ketogenesis as well. And a lot of John Newman's work showed that there are molecular signatures to when the liver actually does make its own ketones. And I think people in the keto community know that taking exogenous ketones isn't just like a straight swap for being on the ketogenic diet. But we think that maybe with fatty acid-based ketone esters with a way of kind of supercharging MCT so that you're actually kind of promoting at least a bit more of that ketogenic process.
Welcome back to another show brought to you by Health Code, the makers of Complete Meal, which in all honesty, it's arguably one of the most comprehensive and complete meal replacement shakes that's out there for low-carb dieters like you. It was formulated by one of our most popular and sought after past podcast guests, metabolic researcher and author of Why We Get Sick, Ben Bikman. So Ben formulated this product to help people like you induce satiety. So a lot of meal replacement shakes out there, they kind of go right through you. So you don't have a lot of satiety inducing mechanisms because they're lacking the combination of fat and protein. Fat and protein together can induce satiety hormones like GLP-1 and CCK and all the different incretin hormones. So you can use this prior to a meal or after a meal if you're snacking or you don't feel totally satiated, or it's a complete meal replacement. If your schedule is uncertain, if you have a new routine, maybe you're going back to work for the first time, maybe your kids are going off to college, maybe you're transitioning to a new diet, this is where a combination of both fat and protein together from whole real food sources like grass-fed collagen, whey protein concentrate, and also egg protein, and plus a healthy fat blend from coconut, olive oil, and much more. It's a really great tasting formula that mixes easily. So you can go over to gethealth.com, that's GETHLTH.com, and check out Complete Meal for yourself. And be sure to use the coupon code HIH at checkout. Again, one more time, that URL is gethealth.com. Brianna, thanks so much for coming out. Great to be with you.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, a little bit of a different environment compared to last time. We did a quick little 5 or 7 minute shot at Metabolic Health Summit. The world has changed a lot since just January. Can you believe it?
I remember traveling to a meeting, and my Uber driver had a mask on, and she said she'd paid $60 for it. And it was like just at that point where it was still, you could either believe it or not believe it.
Right.
And that being at that meeting with hundreds of people, now it just I can't even imagine what it would be like to be with that many people. But it was one of the very last things that I did pre-COVID.
Same.
So I wonder if the event will happen next year. I mean, I was registered, but Who knows?
I hope so. I mean, by May of next year, hopefully things will change, maybe new therapeutics. I don't know, but it's crazy to think that all of the things that we used to look forward to, events, I know you're an endurance athlete, so cycling, running, all these events, weddings, it's really interesting to think that those are not like normal anymore, at least for the immediate future. But getting to today's topic, I was so excited when I saw your Twitter feed and you wrote this paper here. I have it right here. I'll show it on the screen. Investigating ketone bodies as immunometabolic countermeasures against respiratory viral infections. Awesome paper, by the way. I mean, so I did a quick YouTube live and kind of unpacked some of the mechanisms. This was when did it come out? In July?
It must have been about a month ago now.
Okay.
Yeah, so July.
Maybe let's go kind of high level and then dive into all the mechanisms. But immunometabolic countermeasures, that's kind of a big multi-syllabic word, but immunometabolism, I think it's I've been so interested in this for a while, trying to get people excited, but there was no pandemic to cause people to be like, yeah, immunity, yeah, I kind of take vitamin C in the winter. But this idea that we can influence our body's metabolic system and therefore affect our body's immunological response, super fascinating stuff. So
yeah, I think it's not a particularly well-defined term. It's still a nascent field. And I think that there are some trailblazers who are trying to pioneer understanding how different immune cells work differently in terms of their metabolism. And I think this is a concept, even differences between immune cells, right, that's becoming more and more important as we go into COVID. Because, for example, the immune cells that you want to promote at certain times in the immune response aren't the same as you'd want to be looking at later in the immune response. The balance between immune activation and immune suppression and supporting the metabolism and the metabolic state of those different cells, and they transition their metabolism as they go from a resting to an active state. So there's so many different, it's so complicated. And I remember studying immunology at medical school, and I remember the question I always asked was, well, where does this immune response actually start? Because it would all be so sort of cyclical and interdependent. And then also you need the response that shuts down your immune response appropriately as well. So it's very hard to, and I think it's very hard to take one pill that could fix your immune system. And so when we started thinking about ketone bodies, we were really, I don't know, scared or trying to be careful, because inadvertently you could, by shifting metabolism dramatically in one direction, you could have effects, off-target effects that you wouldn't even necessarily expect to be seeing. And also, like I was saying, a timing effect might be really important as well. So the last thing we wanted to do was to seem like we were making a recommendation that people might then just go, go and implement without a lot of the basic biology being understood. And as we started to dig into it, it was interesting going to I can't remember whether I get quite the right word, but like the Human Protein Atlas, and trying to find out which of the immune cells even express BDH1 to metabolize ketone bodies. Not all of them, right? And which of the cells even, so which cells are going to be using ketones versus which cells are going to be doing the oxidative protective response, and you don't want to, there's all kinds of stuff going on. And so the more I got into the topic, the more complicated it became, and the less sure I was about exactly how this was going to work. But it set out this very nice sort of program of research questions that the specialists in those fields could easily answer.
I mean, it's really fascinating, and I agree, and I haven't obviously researched this to the level and depth that you have, but it's very nuanced and complicated. And I think a lot of people will say things like, oh, the ketogenic diet is great for cancer, but it depends on the specific cancer subtype.
Exactly.
And everything like that. So there's a lot of nuances going on. But if we think kind of bigger picture, and what I heard you say right there, which I think is brilliant, is that the immune system leverages different metabolites so as to finance its growth and proliferation at different stages. So, and if we think kind of big picture, if we look at the comorbidities, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, we can, obviously there's different subtypes and etiologies that contribute to the development of those diseases, but if we can paint a big brush stroke, metabolic inflexibility could be one characteristic.
Totally.
And we see glycemic variability. So we could surmise that that sort of metabolic signature is creating some sort of dysregulation within the immune system.
Totally.
Increasing susceptibility.
Yeah, I mean, there's susceptibility, and then there's also, as you mentioned there, comorbidities and recovery time and your risk of developing complications if you do become infected as well. So, aside from thinking about the molecular interactions and the metabolic interactions of ketone bodies with the immune system, one thing we tried to address in the second half of the paper is, the worst has happened and you're hospitalized and you have COVID. What are the things that commonly happen to people in intensive care? They have heart damage, they have delirium, and they have muscle wasting. And how can ketone bodies interact with those comorbid syndromes, rather than just thinking just about the immune system and the potential for increasing, say, protection against COVID. So, there's a lot of layers to this onion. I definitely agree with what you said, that metabolic inflexibility and the increased prevalence of diabetes and poor glycemic control certainly seem to be linked. And perhaps is a reason why America has been harder hit than many other places, and also people from minority backgrounds with, characteristically poorer health as well. So it's just rough for everyone.
Totally, yeah. And what's kind of shocking, and I don't want to make it political or anything along those lines, or I'm not a public health expert, but there's been little to no dietary lifestyle recommendations. It's all about, if we look at different buckets of like what we can do to enhance our health and metabolic health, and therefore immune health, I think that's one bucket. Then the other bucket is like reducing the transmission or slowing the transmission, washing your hands, covering your face, all that. Okay, these are they're mutually exclusive things, but we're only focusing on kind of the latter of slowing the transmission, which, obviously from a public health standpoint, I think it's a very clear, easy to articulate message, socially distance, wash your hands, etc. But you're like, wow, we're leaving so much on the table, and we have like a scared population. If we could just hey, limit your sugar to 20 grams a day or whatever. It's something simple. Get 10,000 steps. I don't know.
Yeah. And I mean, there's some interesting stuff coming out around sunlight and vitamin D and protection as well. I mean, it's hard to know what to follow because, and I think one of the really interesting things, even about publishing this paper and science in this time, is that a lot, and you see it with the Lancet paper that was retracted as well, people are so desperate for answers that they will take any one study either in isolation, and is the quality of that study as rigorous as usual? Has the peer review process taken as much time as usual? It's as a scientist, it's hard to sift through the amount of research that's coming out and discern the quality of the research that's coming out. Given that a lot of the publication processes are expedited for coronavirus. So you hear things. So I was listening to an interesting podcast interview about vitamin D, and I was like, makes sense. And I did all of my research behind this paper, and I'm like, okay, this kind of makes sense. But what do you say? I mean, so actually soon after that paper was published, I was reading I can't think of the type of article it was, but it was an article that was talking about complications of people with COVID, and in type 2 or type 1 diabetics there was an increased rate of ketoacidosis. So I started to think, and the reviewers actually made us put more about the possible downside of ketones in there, because it's important. But obviously there's even stuff going on with metabolism that are making people maybe more insulin resistant, and all kinds of things going on under the hood with this virus that we don't really understand. So
it's important to exercise caution and not jump to conclusions and I think there's a lot of things we don't know. For example, there was one paper that showed that individuals who have increased disease severity have a real sudden drop in cholesterol. So it would be easy to think, and hey, high cholesterol is protective, but you don't really know the direction of causality, like what's going on there. But one thing you said when we first kind of launched this topic of immunometabolism, which is so fascinating, is that the immune system kind of has different flavors or personalities. Like if we look at different T helper cells, for example, or if you look at the macrophage, it can be polarized to the M1 or M2, and part of that polarization is a unique signature within its substrates, which it's utilized glucose versus like fat oxidation.
Yep.
One is more inflammatory, one is more anti-inflammatory. How was that pretty exciting for you to kind of dive into that research and realize, like, wow, there's different immune cells that are, they can change their personality and therefore their metabolism. And so if we can maybe then affect our metabolism, we can affect the personality of that immune cell.
I mean, totally. It was a bit of a baptism of fire, really trying to learn, not quite from scratch, but go back and revisit a lot of this basic immunology. And we were really fortunate to have Emily Goldberg on the team to kind of provide that oversight on immunometabolism. That's her specialty, and she's just setting up a lab here in UCSF where she'll be looking at the ketogenic diet and I think neutrophil function. But even speaking with her, there's so many different subtypes of T cells, T helper, and she's specifically interested in gamma delta T cells, which I'd never really heard of. And also we have Peter Turnbow, who's really into T helper 17 cells. And so you start to get into all of these different cell types, and you realize it's almost like that characters in a musical, right? And they've all got to sing in harmony and at the right time and come on, and you're just trying to, you've been given the score, and it almost doesn't make sense until you see it performed, because you're kind of trying to work out from just reading the music, and unless you were naturally talented, you probably wouldn't have a good picture of what it was meant to sound like until you see it all in action. And so in a way, the paper is dissecting the music score, and we actually don't necessarily know if we took out this harmony or this melody or put in an extra like baseline here, how that would affect the overall performance, whether it would make it better or worse. But that was kind of part of the fun of the project, learning and trying to pull together what we already know about the mechanisms. And there were always certain, I want to use the word extrapolation, but it makes it sound like it was maybe, not based in evidence. So because there's so little known about the coronavirus, we actually don't know whether whether ketone biology that we see in other inflammatory situations would also apply in the situations of the coronavirus, because it has its own unique metabolic or immune response fingerprint. It's going to be triggering. And as we're seeing this, I think in a way, the fact that the pandemic has been so crazy is because our immune systems don't really know how to deal with this, and we're seeing very inappropriate immune responses. So delayed first response, and then when we get to an immune response, it's hyperactive, which is leading to the acute respiratory distress syndrome. And so perhaps our understanding of kind of conventional biology and immunology isn't quite ready to answer those questions about how coronavirus is affecting the body, and which is why the basic research is really important.
Totally. Well, let's unpack, maybe starting with some of the pieces of the paper, the NLRP3 inflammasome, which I think for our non-scientists are going to be like, oh my gosh, this is a big tongue twister. We can unpack it. And I think that's a really important, and you guys highlighted that a lot in the paper. And why I think it's important is because there's this Duke University scientist who's been studying the immunological response to coronaviruses in bats. And it seems like they have a better variability or ability to regulate this key process. And that's what enables them to have an early and robust initial response, and then down-regulate it's basically the exact opposite of how humans respond to coronaviruses. Yeah. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And it seems that maybe children have this similar immunological response. But what is the NLRP3 inflammasome? And is it pretty straightforward, or is there murky research at this point about it?
Well, as far as ketone biology and NLRP3 goes, it's not super clear cut, but we can come back to that in a minute. So when I think about the NLRP3 inflammasome, I think about it as it's a protein complex that assembles as a result of inflammatory stimuli. So you need a couple of different checks in the boxes before it'll get together and do its work. And once it's assembled, it starts helping to cleave and process and release a lot of it doesn't actually do the releasing, but it is a essential conduit for kind of cytokine secretion that's going to direct the immune response. So basically, when you get the NLRP3 inflammasome assembling, you're promoting inflammation. And BHB ketones in vitro and in various animal systems have been shown to inhibit the formation of the NLRP3 inflammasome, and so they decrease the amount of these pro-inflammatory cytokines. So it's funny because in ketone research land, that was kind of accepted, kind of becoming almost dogma. It's like, oh, ketones inhibit inflammation via NLRP3 inflammasome inhibition. However, recently there's actually been a couple of papers using human studies where these pro-inflammatory cytokines have actually been increased in the context of elevated ketones, which is kind of unexpected, not at all the direction we'd have expected it to go in. And we don't know whether that's because of the coexisting metabolic state, whether these in these human studies, whether say glucose levels are higher, and that's attenuating the effects of ketones on NLRP3. And actually, interestingly, and I don't want to get too far off topic, but you've heard of SGLT2 inhibitors. Mm-hmm. So they're a type of drug that's used to treat diabetes, and they also show reductions in risk of cardiovascular disease for people taking these. And a recent really interesting paper looked at, I'm going to try and get this right, the NLRP3, BHB, and glucose interaction. So they titrated up the concentration of BHB and titrated down the concentration of glucose until they found this like sweet spot. Because at high levels of glucose, BHB didn't inhibit the NLRP3 inflammasome, because they think that this anti-inflammatory effect could be part of the reason why these SGLT2 inhibitors decrease cardiovascular disease, to kind of close the loop there. So they think that the ketone, glucose, NLRP3 trifecta has to be just right for these drugs to actually give that cardiovascular protective effect. Now, if that's also true with coronavirus, then we're not just titrating up and down ketone levels. We're also, as you kind of mentioned, going to have to modulate people's glucose exposure as well. And, maybe if we have someone who comes in and they've got raging hyperglycemia, then you don't want to be putting ketones into that situation, because you might then be boosting the immune response, which you're trying to dampen down. So there's quite a lot to unpick here, but it's neat, and we need people doing the basic science to be able to do these experiments in vitro so that we have some idea of how it's going to go up into an in vivo system and then into a human system. But one of the challenges that we sort of came across when we were thinking about this paper and thinking about if we could do any of this work ourselves is that even animal immune systems and the mouse responses to the coronavirus, and all kinds of things are just different between systems. So it's really tough to figure out how to test these hypotheses.
That's super. I mean, it seems like if you're studying like hyperglycemia in an animal, or you feed like some sort of ketogenic chow and look at body composition, that's a much easier question to.
Metabolism itself is a little bit easier and a little bit easier to extrapolate between animals and humans. I still wouldn't do it fully because in some of the work I've been doing recently, we see differences between rats and mice in how they metabolize ketones. We see differences between different strains of mice between how they metabolize ketones. So it's really, I guess I'd caution people, and, for myself as well, we kind of want to read a paper and just assume that hypothesis that's been tested will hold true up into for ourselves as well, but it's just not always the case.
It's good reminder for people, because sometimes we do see papers that come out and it is animal models and people don't really, they just see the abstract and then the findings and so forth. But let's just for folks that might be confused about the NLRP3 inflammasome, if you and I go to McDonald's right now and there was one study that looked at this, I think it was in 2008, where people had like a sausage McMuffin or something like that. We're going to have probably some post-meal, postprandial inflammation. Part of that inflammatory response is mediated by transcription factors, like one of them, NF-kappa B. Mm-hmm. Where is the NLRP3 inflammasome? I'm just trying to visualize, and maybe this can help people cement the idea. Is it downstream of the transcript? So we have this element that turns genes on or off. That's the transcription factor. Where does the NLRP3 fit into that? I can't remember.
Well, it is when it's assembled as a protein complex, so it's downstream of the transcription factors that are affecting gene expression. So transcription factors are the things that are turning on and off your genes. The genes get transcribed and then they form the proteins that are downstream of that.
Okay, so it's related to that NF-kappa B process, but more downstream.
I'm not sure if NLRP3 is downstream of NF-kappa B, but it would be downstream of a transcription factor of some sort.
Okay, that's super. I mean, just to give people an idea of like kind of visualizing how this thing is working, I think it's really interesting. But yeah, that nuance of looking at ketones in the context of glucose, because that's where I think some people can go wrong with the ketogenic diet in general, or looking at studies in athletes. I know there's a lot of controversy as to whether or not ketones help athletes or not, and that aspect's not considered.
Yeah.
I know you have a lot of thoughts on that.
Yeah, that could be a whole other podcast. Yeah. Maybe we do that one next time.
We should. But let's unpack the paper a little bit more. It's been a little while since I've read this, but oxidative stress seems like a big theme that kept coming up in multiple ways. And maybe before we get into that, because I think that's a big hole, is it NADPH? This redox sensor.
Yeah.
That's another one that we've heard about. Again, I don't want to lose people in the weeds of molecular biology, but this idea that ketones help to affect kind of the energetic status of the cell from a redox standpoint.
Yeah, and I mean, this was like a fantastic learning experience for me. And the person who started educating me on this was Dr. Richard Veach, who recently passed away, but he was one of the kind of grandfathers of metabolism and understanding how this kind of redox biology worked. But a colleague of his, William Curtis, and I had some really, really great discussions because he'd really, really had a really good grasp of what Dr. Veach had been studying. And so really what they call the concept is great controlling nucleotides. So pretty much every reaction metabolism in our cell uses NAD or NADH in some interconversion, and then that's mainly in the mitochondria, and then in the cytoplasm of our cells we've got NADP and NADPH. And so shuttling it's almost like a redox buffering capacity. And if people want to think about that, I guess it's like too much oxidative stress is bad, and then too much reductive stress is also bad. Your cell kind of is trying to keep itself in this sweet spot. And so you need to have enough power to kind of keep all of that in balance. And so with coronavirus, you need an oxidative response in your immune cells because production of radicals can actually help to kill infected cells or destroy and harm the virus. But actually, there's a lot of collateral damage when you get that. So also for your non-infected cells and your non-immune cells, you actually need to be able to protect yourself against oxidative stress. And as you start to mount your immune response, the cell gets stressed, it loses some of that buffering capacity. And so it can be even more vulnerable to damage. And so with ketone metabolism, and I don't want to go into all of the sort of like metabolic pathways, but it can boost the ability in the cytoplasm to be able to absorb some of those homeostatic challenges. So it kind of is not only, it's just helping, it's providing a bit more of a reservoir for our cells to be able to deal with stressful situations.
So more resilient. And that's one thing that Dom D'Agostino has talked a lot about, is helping individual ketones kind of help under environmental extremes. And maybe we can liken this hyper free radical or excessive amount of oxidative stress as like a cellular environmental extreme of sorts. And I think that's super fascinating. I know that you study ketones a lot, the whole NMN and NAD.
Yeah.
Do you take those personally, or what?
I don't take them. We're doing an awful lot of research in that at the Buck. So Dr. Eric Verdin's obviously like his lab research is NAD biology, and he has several projects going on looking at different ways that NAD metabolism could be modulated to improve lifespan. So I'm pretty close to the source. And so I get good information. I mean, I guess that maybe also if these supplements at the moment, what's out there, some of it's good quality, some of it's not so much. So there are a couple of companies that I've heard are better that I would use if I was going to use this kind of thing, but it's still kind of expensive. And until maybe when I hit 40, I'll start trying to age the other way, but I'm still not quite 30 yet. So at what point do you start your anti-aging kind of plan?
When you're doing so much anyway, I mean, running and fasting and keto, it's like, I mean, it seems like if you're doing all of that and you don't have any other health conditions, is the $120 a month first.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of money if you think about what you could do with that money from a diet standpoint. But
yeah, for sure. I mean, I just try and get like good whole foods and eat a balanced diet right now. But, I think there's a lot of interesting research in the NMN and NR space. Also, other companies starting to really push the boundaries of longevity supplements. I think there's an interesting space to be watching. And I think, especially being at the Buck and embedded there, you can see how much the research is about to hit an inflection point. Investment is about to hit an inflection point. We're going to have to change a lot of things about how our society works to cope with this aging population.
Totally.
So I think longevity is really going to be like the next hot topic for everyone, and not just those of us who are kind of health conscious. So I'm excited to be in the field.
I agree 100%. And then just looking at one of the biggest risk factors for this virus was age is a big one, right? And so, and there's some discordance there with epigenetic age and Horvath clocks, and you might be 47, but biologically maybe you're 60. And so you see these seemingly young, healthy people that maybe have underlying diseases and so forth. And I don't know, have you gotten into the Horvath clock or tested yours yet? Or
no, I would love to. I've been reading an awful lot about it, and I would love to test it, but I haven't had it done just yet.
I had mine done.
Oh, you
I'm
did?
3 years biologically older than I am chronologically.
That's not too bad.
Yeah, so I was like, all right, and I know what, sleep is my issue. Like, so I'm always up late editing or researching or doing stuff like that with videos. And I'm like, that to me was like testing can be a great motivator to affect your lifestyle change. Cause you're like, well, Mike, it's right here. It's like you're older than like you should be. So. Yeah.
We at the Buck, we have a professor called Dr. David Furman, and he has an inflammatory aging clock, which I'm excited to try out as well.
Cool.
So he's the director of the Stanford 1000 Immunomes project. And so they've, using AI, they've got a lot of immunological phenotypes, thousands of people, and they can use that to predict your immune status to predict your age as well.
Oh my gosh.
It's kind of interesting.
Is it commercially available at this point? Or?
I think it is actually through a company called Edifice.
Oh my gosh.
So, yeah,
I'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah.
So cool. I'm going to have to check. That's awesome.
The Bucks, there's lots of cool stuff going on at the Bucks.
Jeez, I know. Gosh, what like a major, career change. I mean, that must be so amazing. Like every day is like a field day, right? It's like you're like on a field trip, but you get to get paid to like do this cool research and work with these great people.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly challenges. I was recently involved in a big grant application, and all of this paperwork and all of writing a good research plan. But it is pretty cool to be surrounded by people who are at the forefront of what they do and pushing the boundaries. And yeah, it gets me up every morning for sure.
So awesome. That's really cool. There's a few other things on the paper. So we talked about the NADPH and free radical stress.
Yeah.
We talked about the NLRP3 inflammasome. There were some anti-catabolic properties that were elucidated, and I think we've kind of unpacked that, and Andrew Kutnick's work and Dom's. Pretty exciting.
Got to give Andrew like a huge shout out, because if he hadn't come along and been like, this is really, really cool. He's got so much energy, and he turned this from just, me writing 2 or 3 pages, just kind of my own notes, into that paper, and he really helped to drive it. And, the expertise that he brings to the molecular mechanisms of ketones as an anti-catabolic agent. I mean, I'd really encourage everyone to go and look at his paper that came out earlier this year that looked at ketones as an anti-catabolic agent for cancer, but also importantly for inflammatory stress triggered by bacterial threat. And so we think that when you start getting further downstream of the virus, if you're just looking at systemic inflammation, then I think you're on a bit surer ground to make extrapolations. So some of the stuff that we talk about in this paper about really obscure, like HNRP3 or A1 mRNA interaction, that's like very specific and very close to like the viral replication. But as you start to get to, the virus just triggers lots of cytokine release, you get lots of downstream inflammatory processes. Muscle wasting is one of those things that's kind of triggered by quite non-specific inflammation. And so I think that Andrew's work showing that ketones were protective against LPS-induced inflammation probably has quite a good chance of being generalizable over to like viral inflammation as well. And, we're seeing young, healthy people taking weeks and weeks and weeks to recover from this, and older people as well. And, the longer that an older person is hospitalized or immobile, the harder it's going to be for them to recover their function and be able to live independently. So even if ketones, being on a ketogenic diet or taking exogenous ketones doesn't treat or prevent you getting from the virus, it may help with recovery. So I think there's a lot of potential for investigation there. But yeah, certainly, even just with any other syndromes of aging, I think if Andrew's seminal work with Dom and Dr. Brendan Egan as well, all thinking about this role of ketones in muscle biology, if some of that can be proven out in human models, that'll be fantastic. And there is, again, some early indications that might be the case from a few limited human studies, but there's still a bit more work to be done there. And Andrew's set up at the IHMC now, so I hope he has a chance to look at some of that, because they have good collaborations with like NASA and all. It'd be cool like if NASA would fund it, because there's lots of muscle loss in space. Yeah, that'd be kind of neat.
Muscle as an organ of longevity. I mean, it's really exciting to see in that property. And going back to some of the earlier papers showing that part of what, why ketones are made might be to preserve muscle mass and take off that glucose.
But they're a starvation metabolite, right?
Yeah.
If we were breaking down our muscle to provide glucose, or if muscle breakdown happened as quickly as it should happen, then we would die within days to weeks, rather than when ketone metabolism kicks in, we can go for much longer without food. And Andrew, I'm going to get it wrong, but I'll have a go. But he said that, I think it's in the context of low insulin, normally that's like a very, and low insulin is normally very pro-catabolic. But in the ketogenic diet, you've got this low insulin state and not very much catabolism. So there must be something going on. And his hypothesis is that ketone bodies in the context of low insulin are what prevents that becoming like a super catabolic situation. I mean, you should have him on the podcast, because
we did. Yeah. It was years ago, and it was outside, but I would love to catch up with him again. He's such a great guy, and he walks a walk and he exercises and all these things so it's great to, I love interviewing people like yourself who not only know this, but apply it to their life. And so like before, you came over here, you ran how many miles?
8 miles.
8 miles. Like most people can't run in the hills. So it's undulating terrain.
Yeah, quite a lot of hills, a lot more than I planned for.
Yeah, that's awesome though.
No,
that's great. So final question, do you take MCTs or exogenous ketones?
I do periodically, but I don't have like a fixed regimen.
Okay.
So I've been finding that using a little bit of MCTs in like coffee or like a creamy drink definitely curbs my like cravings and appetite. I quite like using a little bit of MCT, but I mix it with carbs before if I'm going to do a morning workout that's a bit more intense. So this morning I ran fasted because it was pretty low intensity, and I'm still fasted now. I try and do some of my lower intensity morning training fasted, but if I'm doing a workout that's a bit more intense, I'll normally HVMN actually make this really tasty like MCT and also MCT collagen mixes, and I quite like mixing those in with like some banana or something in a smoothie, so I get a little bit of carbs and also that little boost of ketones as well. But then I'm always tinkering with exogenous ketones. A lot of it's for my work and sort of self-experimentation. And I'm looking forward to there being like more options for people to try and for me to try with different types of exogenous ketones. But that's part of what I'm working on to kind of increase the research and also increase the number of compounds and products that there are available for people to try. So I think it's an interesting space. A lot of what is there right now, so MCTs are relying on your body's ketogenic process. Ketone salts, they deliver BHB directly into the blood, so you're not getting any of that natural ketogenesis. And esters are this kind of like hybrid between direct delivery and, actually, depending on the compound, you don't get any classical hepatic ketogenesis from those. And so some of the stuff we're looking at Buck is fatty acid-based ketone esters. And so we're trying to get the benefits of both, some direct BHB delivery and some hepatic ketogenesis as well. And a lot of John Newman's work showed that there are molecular signatures to when the liver actually does make its own ketones. And I think people in the keto community know that taking exogenous ketones isn't just like a straight swap for being on the ketogenic diet. But we think that maybe with fatty acid based ketone esters with a way of kind of supercharging MCT so that you're actually kind of promoting at least a bit more of that ketogenic process. And, I'm starting to get deep into the weeds of ratios between BHB and acetoacetate, for example. So again, with salts and the monoester, BHB and butanediol, you're kind of going much more in the BHB direction. And Dom D'Agostino has the acetoacetate diester, which goes more towards the acetoacetate. And what happens if you do this more like fatty acid based approach? Is it more physiological? So, and the more and more, and I'm starting to really get into the weeds of what is the difference between BHB and acetoacetate. So Peter Crawford has some really interesting papers showing that acetoacetate does some things that BHB just doesn't do. And unfortunately, acetoacetate is really hard to measure. So when we use the handheld meter, we're only measuring BHB. So there's all this ketone we're just not really accounting for. It's hard to measure, so people don't do it.
Right.
So I'm interested in starting to understand the differences there. And so there's all sort of like signaling, metabolism, BHB, acetoacetate, RBHB, SBHB, all of the different ways that we can play with exogenous ketones and understand the biology so that hopefully as we start to understand disease better, we can target the immunometabolic countermeasure specifically to that right time and cell type and hopefully improve outcomes. But I mean, there's a lot of research to do still.
Oh my gosh. People are going to hit the rewind button and re-listen to that a few times because there's so much to unpack right there. And I think that we could talk about that on another time. But thank you as always for sharing such great information. It's great to have you on. I'll put links to this paper. Keep up the amazing work.
Thanks,
and if you have new information on acetoacetate BHB ratios in this,
sorry to just knowledge bomb you at the end.
No, it's amazing. It's all the good stuff on these podcasts. I've been doing this for like 5 years now. They always come right at the end. Right? That's just how it is. But yeah, have a great rest of your day. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much.